We live in a paradoxical era. Never before in the history of humanity have we been so connected, and at the same time, never have we felt so isolated. Our digital lives intertwine with our physical realities, creating a complex web of relationships that shape who we are and how we live. But something is happening in the shadows of this hyperconnection, something that is silently corroding the fabric of our communities, our workplaces, and even our families. We're talking about a phenomenon that psychologists and sociologists have been studying with growing concern: the rise of toxic behaviors in our society. Imagine waking up every day and feeling a weight on your chest before you even open your eyes. Imagine going to work knowing that someone there will try to undermine your confidence, your ideas, your worth. Imagine coming home, hoping to find peace, but encountering constant criticism, emotional manipulation, or an icy silence that hurts more than any words. For millions of people around the world, this is not imagination. It's the daily reality of living surrounded by toxic people. But what exactly makes a person toxic? This is a question that doesn't have a simple answer, because human toxicity manifests in countless forms. It could be the colleague who always takes credit for others' work. It could be the family member who uses love as currency, offering affection only when you meet their expectations. It could be the friend who only shows up when they need something, but disappears when you need support. It could be the romantic partner who gradually isolates you from everyone you love, making you believe that only they truly care. Before we continue with this deep journey through the universe of toxic relationships, I'd like to make a request. If this content is making sense to you, subscribe to the channel and leave in the comments what time you're watching this video. This helps us better understand our audience and continue bringing relevant content to your life. Toxicity in human relationships is nothing new. Since the dawn of civilization, there have been individuals who caused harm to others, whether for personal gain, through learned patterns, or simply because they knew no other way to relate. What has changed, however, is the scale and speed with which these behaviors spread. Social media has created stages where cruelty can be performed for global audiences. The extreme competitiveness of the modern job market has turned colleagues into adversaries. Social fragmentation has created bubbles where harmful behaviors are normalized and even celebrated. Let's start by exploring the workplace, because that's where many of us spend most of our waking hours. The modern office, whether physical or virtual, has become a minefield of toxic dynamics. There's obsessive micromanagement, where leaders unable to trust their teams control every minute, every decision, every breath of their subordinates. This type of behavior doesn't just stem from personal insecurity, although that is a factor. It's often reinforced by corporate cultures that value control over creativity, conformity over innovation. Then there's the phenomenon of professional gaslighting, where your perceptions and experiences are constantly questioned and invalidated. You present a legitimate concern about work overload, and you're told you're being too sensitive, that everyone goes through the same thing, that you need to be more resilient. You point out inappropriate behavior from a superior, and suddenly you're the problem, you're the one creating drama, you're the one who doesn't fit the company culture. Workplace bullying has evolved. It's no longer just the boss yelling or publicly humiliating, although that still happens with alarming frequency. Now it disguises itself as harmless jokes that accumulate over time, eroding your self-esteem. It hides in subtle exclusions, where you're not invited to important meetings or informal conversations that build connections. It manifests in silent sabotage, where critical information doesn't reach you, or reaches you too late to be useful. And here's something few discuss openly: often, toxic people at work aren't punished because they're productive. They bring results, so their character flaws are tolerated, excused, or completely ignored. This creates a culture where the end justifies the means, where it's acceptable to harm someone's psychological well-being if it means hitting quarterly targets. But the workplace is just one facet of the problem. Let's now enter an even more delicate and painful territory: toxic family relationships. Family should be our safe haven, the place where we're unconditionally accepted, where we can be vulnerable without fear. For many, however, family is the primary source of emotional pain. Narcissistic parents who see their children as extensions of themselves, existing only to validate their needs and feed their egos. These parents cannot see their children as separate individuals with their own desires, dreams, and personalities. Each child's achievement is appropriated as validation of the parent. Each failure is seen as a personal shame. Love is conditional, dependent on performance, obedience, total conformity. There's also the dynamic of the family scapegoat, where one person is chosen, consciously or unconsciously, to carry all the blame and responsibility for the family's problems. No matter what happens, somehow it will always be that person's fault. Parents' marriage is troubled? It's because that child is too difficult. Finances are tight? It's because that child asks for too much. Someone is unhappy? It must be because of that problematic person. This dynamic can haunt someone for decades, shaping their self-image in profoundly destructive ways. And then we have the emotional vampires, those family members who drain all the energy from an environment. They always have a crisis, always need rescuing, always turn any conversation into a monologue about their problems. But when you need them, suddenly they're busy, they're dealing with their own issues, they don't have the emotional capacity to help. The relationship is one-directional, a river that flows only one way. What makes toxic family relationships particularly insidious is the cultural and social burden that compels us to maintain them. We're constantly bombarded with messages that family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that we must forgive and forget no matter what happens. This social pressure keeps many people trapped in cycles of harmful emotional dynamics for years, decades, sometimes a lifetime. Now, let's explore another minefield of human relationships: toxic friendships. Friendships should be sources of joy, mutual support, shared growth. But some friendships become subtle traps that lock us into harmful patterns. There's the competitive friend who cannot genuinely rejoice in your victories. When you share good news, their reaction is always to minimize your achievement or quickly change the subject to something they accomplished. You got a promotion? They got a better one 3 months ago. You're happy in a relationship? They'll point out all the ways your partner is inferior to theirs. You lost weight? They lost more. There's no room for two people to shine in this friendship. Only one can be on top. Then there's the inconsistent friend, whom you only see when it's convenient for them. They disappear for months, but when they need something, a favor, a shoulder to lean on, a place to stay, they resurface as if nothing had happened. And you, wanting to believe in the friendship, welcome them. But as soon as their need is met, they evaporate again, leaving you feeling used and foolish for believing this time would be different. There's also the controlling friend who needs to dictate the terms of every interaction. You always do what they want to do, go where they want to go, talk about what they want to discuss. When you try to introduce something different, somehow the situation is manipulated back to their comfort. They might use guilt, they might use drama, they might simply ignore your suggestions until you give up. And there's a particularly painful form of toxic friendship, the one where the friend subtly sabotages your self-esteem while pretending to care. They make comments disguised as concern that are actually harmful criticism. You're wearing something you like, and they say it's brave of you to wear that despite it not being exactly flattering for your body type. You share a dream, and they say they admire your courage to try something so difficult, planting doubt disguised as praise. But perhaps the most complex and painful territory of toxic relationships is the romantic one. When we think of toxic romantic relationships, we often imagine extreme and obvious situations. And those situations certainly exist and are devastating. But there are forms of romantic toxicity that are much more subtle and, for that very reason, more difficult to identify and escape. Let's talk about emotional manipulation in intimate relationships. It's when your partner uses your vulnerabilities, your deepest fears, your insecurities, to exercise control over you. You shared with them that you fear abandonment due to past experiences, and now, whenever there's a conflict, they threaten to end the relationship, knowing exactly which button they're pressing. You trusted them about your physical insecurities, and now they make subtle comments that feed them, keeping you insecure and dependent on their validation. There's also the phenomenon of gradual isolation. In the beginning, it might seem romantic. They want to spend all their time with you. They don't like when you go out with friends because they'd rather be with you. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, You start seeing your friends less, your family less. Perhaps not through direct prohibition, but through a series of uncomfortable incidents, fights that happen whenever you plan to see other people, dark moods that make it easier to simply cancel plans. Before you realize it, your support network has disappeared, and you're completely dependent on this person for companionship, validation, sense of reality. And that's exactly when you become most vulnerable, because now leaving seems impossible. Where would you go? Who would you talk to? You've distanced yourself from everyone. There's also the issue of pathological jealousy disguised as intense love. Your partner checks your phone, questions every interaction, accuses you of infidelity without evidence, but frames all of this as proof of how much they care, of how unbearable the thought of losing you is. And you, wanting to believe in love, accept the violation of privacy, the constant distrust, the suffocating control. What all these forms of toxicity have in common, whether at work, in family, in friendships, or romantic relationships, is a pattern of behavior that consistently harms another person's emotional and psychological well-being. And here's something crucial to understand. Toxic people aren't always bad. Often, they're acting from their own pain, their own unprocessed trauma, their own dysfunctional coping mechanisms. This doesn't excuse the behavior. Absolutely not. But understanding this helps us navigate these situations with more clarity. Someone who is toxic because they never learned healthy ways to relate is still causing harm. Someone who is controlling because they have a deep fear of abandonment is still violating your boundaries. Someone who is manipulative because they were manipulated in childhood is still being manipulative. The question then becomes, what do we do with this information? How do we navigate a world where toxic people are increasingly common, or perhaps where we're just more aware of their existence? The first and most important tool is recognition. You can't solve a problem you can't see. Many people live for years, even decades, in toxic situations without really naming what's happening. They know they feel bad, they know something is wrong, but they can't articulate exactly what it is. Learning to identify toxic patterns is like developing a new sense. Suddenly, you start seeing things that were always there, but you didn't have the language to describe. The second tool is boundaries. Healthy boundaries are like the emotional immune system. They determine what you allow into your psychological space and what you keep out. People who grew up in toxic environments often never developed healthy boundaries because their boundaries were constantly violated. They were taught that setting boundaries is selfish, is cruel, is a rejection of love. But boundaries aren't walls that isolate. They're doors that you control, deciding what comes in and what stays out. Establishing boundaries with toxic people can seem impossible at first. They will test, they will push, they will use all available emotional tactics to make you give in. They'll accuse you of having changed, of not caring anymore, of being selfish. They'll make you feel guilty. They'll create drama. They'll threaten consequences. And here's the test. Can you maintain your boundaries even when it's difficult, even when you feel bad, even when the other person is having an intense emotional reaction? The third tool, and perhaps the most difficult, is accepting that some relationships need to end. We live in a culture that idolizes perseverance in relationships. We're taught that giving up is weakness, that strong people fight for relationships, that true love conquers all. But there's a difference between working through normal relationship challenges and remaining in a fundamentally harmful dynamic. Ending a toxic relationship, especially with family or a long-term partner, can feel like a death. There's real grief even when you know it's the right decision. You're mourning not just the person, but the version of the relationship you always hoped it would become. You're mourning the time invested, the shared memories, the identity you built around that connection. But here's a truth that needs to be said: you don't owe loyalty to relationships that are harming you. You're not obligated to sacrifice your own well-being to keep others comfortable. Your first commitment should be to your own well-being, your own mental health, your own peace. Now, it's also important to look in the mirror and ask a difficult question. In any of my relationships, am I the toxic person? This is a question we should all be willing to honestly consider. Because all of us, at some point, have exhibited behaviors that harm others. We've all manipulated, been selfish, put our needs above others in harmful ways. The difference between occasionally acting harmfully and being a toxic person lies in patterns. It lies in the willingness to recognize when we've harmed someone. It lies in the capacity to take genuine responsibility without playing the victim. It lies in the commitment to change behaviors, not just promise change, but actually do the difficult work of personal growth. If you recognize toxic patterns in yourself, that doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you a human person, capable of self-awareness and growth. What you do with that recognition is what defines your character. Do you justify yourself, blame your childhood, your circumstances, other people? Or do you take responsibility for breaking those patterns? As we move toward the conclusion of this exploration, it's essential to recognize that we're living in a time of collective mental health crisis. The pandemic exacerbated this, but the problems existed before. We're dealing with unprecedented levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, alienation. And amid this crisis, hurt people are hurting people. Scared people are scaring people. People trying to survive emotionally are, without realizing it, making others' emotional survival more difficult. The solution isn't simple because the problem isn't simple. There's no single answer that will resolve the proliferation of toxicity in our human relationships. But there are possible paths. It starts with each of us doing the internal work of healing our own wounds, understanding our own patterns, developing self-awareness and emotional intelligence. It continues with creating communities and cultures that value emotional health as much as productivity. It progresses through education, teaching the next generations about healthy relationships, respectful communication, constructive emotional processing. We need work systems that don't reward toxic behavior simply because it's productive. We need social structures that don't force people to remain in harmful family relationships in the name of tradition. We need cultural narratives that celebrate the courage to set boundaries, to choose yourself, to say no. At the deepest level, the rise of toxic people in our society is a symptom of a culture that often values the wrong things. We value success over integrity. We value appearances over authenticity. We value accumulation over connection. And these distorted values create environments where toxic behaviors not only exist but thrive. Changing this requires nothing less than a reimagining of how we live together, how we treat each other, what we consider important. It requires vulnerability, courage, and commitment to growth, both individual and collective. It requires that we recognize our fundamental interconnection, that one person's suffering affects us all, that one person's healing benefits everyone. As we navigate this complex and often painful world of human relationships, we carry both responsibility and opportunity. The responsibility not to perpetuate cycles of pain, to do the difficult work of self-knowledge and growth. And the opportunity to create something different, to be the person who breaks generational patterns, who chooses kindness when cruelty would be easier, who builds bridges where others built walls. May we have the wisdom to recognize toxicity when we encounter it, the courage to walk away when necessary, and the compassion to remember that hurt people, but healing is always possible too. May we create spaces in our lives for relationships that nourish instead of drain, that elevate instead of diminish, that honor the dignity and humanity of everyone involved. And may we trust that, even amid the chaos and pain of imperfect human relationships, there is always hope for transformation, always possibility of healing, always the chance to choose a different path. May the Lord God give us the strength to recognize and transform what hurts us, and the wisdom to cultivate what heals us. May we find peace in our relationships and courage to always seek what is true, just, and loving in our lives.